For 7 years, Kang Min-jae looked straight through the woman he loved, convinced silence would keep her alive. He never imagined the day she'd stop waiting. Kneeling before her would be another man, holding the one thing his empire could never buy her: an easy, uncomplicated love. If you believe 7 years of silence is never an excuse to make someone feel invisible, hit like and subscribe right now. Only the cold-hearted, the manipulators, and the men who mistake control for love would scroll past this without joining us. Stay close. Amara's story is about to change everything. Seoul had a rule for men like Kang Min-jae. Love was a liability, so he wore indifference the way other men wore cologne: thick, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Nobody in the city knew that the coldest man in Korea had spent 7 years protecting a woman by pretending she didn't exist. The first thing you need to understand about Kang Min-jae is that he never raised his voice. He didn't have to. Men who ran cartels the size of small countries learned early that silence, delivered correctly, could do more damage than a bullet. He used it on business partners who tried to skim off the top. He used it on rivals who thought his empire was ripe for the taking. And for 7 long years, he used it on Amara, the one person in Seoul he would have burned the whole city down to protect. Amara didn't know any of that, of course. All she knew was the particular flavor of humiliation that came from loving a man who looked through her like she was a smudge on his window. She'd arrived at his estate at 22, carrying her father's debts and a duffel bag that held everything she owned, which, at the time, wasn't much. Her father had made the mistake of borrowing money from people who didn't believe in payment plans, only consequences. When he died before he could pay it back, the debt didn't die with him. It simply found a new address, and that address was Amara. Min Jae could have handled it with a wire transfer. Instead, he handled it with a house, a room, a seat at his table, and absolutely nothing else. No warmth, no explanation, just the quiet, suffocating message that she was to be seen and never acknowledged. Like fine art hung in a hallway, nobody walked down anymore. "You'll stay here," he told her the first night, not looking up from his tablet. "You'll want for nothing. Don't mistake that for anything else." She hadn't. Not at first. But 7 years is a long time to sit across a table from a man and watch him not see you. And somewhere around year 3, wanting nothing had quietly become wanting everything. His attention, his voice, one unguarded look that wasn't laced with irritation. She used to joke, darkly, to the only mirror who'd listen, that she'd become fluent in a language called silence, Kang Min-jae dialect. Cold glances meant, "Don't embarrass me tonight." A curt dismissal in front of guests meant, "Sit down and disappear." And the particular quiet that followed her into empty rooms meant nothing at all, which was somehow worse than meaning something cruel. His enemies noticed her, of course. Powerful families circled Min-jae's empire like sharks smelling blood and water that hadn't spilled yet, and they clocked Amara early. The charity case, the stray he'd apparently kept around out of some rich man's boredom. They laughed about her at galas behind champagne flutes. They placed bets, genuinely, actual money, on how long she'd last before she packed her duffel bag and finally admitted she meant nothing to the untouchable Kang Min-jae. Here's the part nobody in that ballroom understood. Min-jae was performing for them, not her. Every cold glance was a message sent directly to his enemies. There is nothing here worth taking from me, because he'd learned, in the ugliest way a man can learn anything, that in his world, love wasn't a soft thing you gotta keep. It was a target painted on the back of the one person too innocent to know she was standing in the crosshairs. He paid for that lie nightly, alone, in a penthouse office that looked out over a city that thought it knew him. He'd sit with his phone in his hand, her contact glowing on the screen, and rehearse sentences he would never let himself say. "I kept you close because I couldn't survive keeping you safe from a distance. I was cruel to you on purpose, because cruelty doesn't get kidnapped for ransom." He deleted every draft. A man who ran half the underworld in Seoul, and he couldn't finish one honest text message, which is exactly the kind of toxic, self-sabotaging nonsense that should make you furious right now. A man loving someone so much he decided the safest way to show it was to make her feel invisible for 7 straight years. If you think that's romantic, we need to talk. If you think Amara deserves so much better than a man who confused silence with sacrifice, say so in the comments, because I promise you, it gets worse before, if It gets better. Because somewhere in year 5, Amara stopped waiting for his eyes to change color when he looked at her. And that decision was about to detonate everything Kang Min-jae had spent 7 years building. Amara's resignation letter to her own hope was 3 years in the making. But the moment it finally got signed came on a Tuesday in the cereal aisle of a grocery store, of all places. She was standing there, holding a box of something she didn't even like, when her phone buzzed with a calendar reminder, Gala, 7 p.m. Attend as Min-jae's +1. Unofficial. Unofficial. That word had followed her through 11 galas that year alone. She would get dressed in silk gowns paid for by his accountant, ride in his car, stand 3 respectful feet behind him at every event, and answer to nothing but the woman who comes with Mr. Kang. Because apparently, after 7 years, she still hadn't earned a name in his world, only a designation, like a piece of furniture that occasionally needed reupholstering. She put the cereal back. She didn't even remember picking it up. That night at the gala, she watched Min-jae work a room the way other men worked a gym. Efficient, disciplined, no wasted motion, and absolutely no joy in it. He shook hands. He nodded at exactly the right moments. He let his gaze pass over her twice, both times with the warmth of a man checking whether a chair was still in its place. And for the first time in 7 years, something in Amara didn't ache. It just stopped, quietly, like a clock finally allowed to run out of batteries. I'm done, she thought, watching him laugh, actually laugh, at something a business partner said. A laugh she had never once been the reason for. I have spent a third of my life waiting for a man who has decided I am furniture, and furniture doesn't get to fall in love. Furniture gets dusted. She left the gala early. Nobody stopped her. That, more than anything, told her everything she needed to know. The International Charity Foundation had been recruiting her for months, quietly, respectfully, the way people recruit someone they actually want instead of someone they're settling for. She kept turning them down out of some loyalty she no longer understood the shape of. This time, she said yes before she'd even finished reading the offer letter twice. Her first day, she met a man named Daniel Morgan, and the universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor after all. Daniel ran the foundation's donor relations department, and within 4 minutes of meeting her, he'd made her laugh twice, asked her name 3 times to make sure he got the pronunciation right, and remembered that she took her coffee black, simply because she'd mentioned it once in passing while ranting about a broken office machine. You seem like someone who spent a long time being underestimated, Daniel said one afternoon, handing her a coffee she hadn't asked for, made exactly the way she liked it. That obvious? Only to someone who's paying attention. He shrugged, like paying attention to a woman wasn't a revolutionary act, when in Amara's experience, it absolutely was. I plan on doing a lot of that, if you'll let me. If you'll let me. 2 words no one in Kang Min-jae's world had ever bothered to say to her, because they'd never once considered that her permission was required for anything. Here is where I have to ask you something, because I think you already know the answer. How many of you have loved someone who made you feel like an inconvenience, only to meet someone else who made loving you look effortless? Drop a comment, because Amara's story is about to prove exactly why nobody, should have to beg to be someone's priority. And if you think a man's silence is ever an acceptable substitute for actually showing up, we are going to disagree loudly in this comment section. Daniel didn't hide his admiration the way Min-jae hid his obsession. He didn't perform indifference at parties or treat her like a liability to be managed. He simply, plainly, consistently chose her, out loud, in public, every single day. The way normal people who aren't running criminal empires apparently did it. It took 4 months for Amara to realize she was falling for him. It took 6 for her to admit that falling wasn't the right word anymore. She had already landed. And it took exactly 1 golden, glittering charity gala under 1,000 crystal lights for Daniel to decide the whole city should know it. Ring box in his jacket pocket, 3 words rehearsed on his tongue, utterly unaware that across that same ballroom stood the one man whose entire 7-year silence was about to shatter into 1,000 pieces, along with the glass in his hand. The charity gala that night was the kind Seoul threw when it wanted to remind itself it was civilized. Crystal chandeliers imported from Vienna, a orchestra playing something that sounded expensive, and enough diamonds in the room to bail out a small nation. Amara stood near the dessert table in a navy gown Daniel had picked out himself, which was its own kind of miracle, because Kang Min-jae had never once picked out anything for her that wasn't a leash disguised as a gift. She didn't know Min-jae would be there. She should have. He funded half the foundations in this city the way other men funded golf memberships. Quietly, strategically, and always with strings nobody could see until they yanked. She spotted him across the ballroom the way you spot a storm cloud on an otherwise clear day. Not because you're looking for it, but because some animal part of you never stops scanning the horizon for the thing that once hurt you. He was in black, unreadable as ever, a glass of scotch in his hand, nodding along to some minister's speech about clean water initiatives while looking, as always, like a man attending his own funeral out of politeness. She almost laughed. 7 years of that face, and she still hadn't decided if it was a mask or all that was left underneath one. Then Daniel took her hand. "Can I have everyone's attention?" His voice cracked slightly, which somehow made it better, more human, less like something rehearsed for cameras. The orchestra slowed. Heads turned. Somewhere, a photographer's instincts kicked in a full 3 seconds before Daniel actually got down on one knee. Because photographers can smell a headline the way sharks smell blood. "Amara," Daniel said. And even now, even mid-proposal, he said her name like it mattered. Like it was the whole sentence and everything after was just punctuation. "I've spent my whole life being told love should be complicated to be real. You taught me that's a lie. You deserve someone who chooses you loudly, every day, in front of everyone. So I'm doing exactly that. Marry me." The ring caught the chandelier light and threw it across the ballroom like a net catching stars. Exactly the way ridiculous, glittering proposals do in the moment right before somebody's whole life changes. Cameras flashed. Guests gasped, then applauded, then gasped again when they remembered whose ballroom this technically was. And across the room, Kangmin Jae's glass slipped out of his hand. It didn't shatter loudly. Glass rarely does when you expect it to. But the sound cut through the applause like a gunshot through silence. Because everyone in that room had spent years learning that Kangmin Jae did not drop things. He did not fumble. He did not react. He was a man built entirely out of controlled variables. And for one unguarded second, in front of half the powerful families in Seoul, the variable broke. His face, that face Amara had spent 7 years failing to read, cracked open for exactly 1 second into something raw and unmistakable. Devastation. Then it slammed shut again. But 1 second was all the room needed. Because in Seoul's underworld, a second is a confession. And every rival who had spent a decade hunting for Kang Min Jae's weakness finally found it. Spelled out in shattered crystal at his feet, 30 feet from a woman wearing another man's ring. Amara hadn't even answered Daniel yet. She was still frozen, ring box glittering in his outstretched hand, when she caught Min Jae's eyes across the ballroom. Really caught them, for what felt like the first time in 7 years, and saw something there she had spent half a decade convinced didn't exist. It wasn't indifference. It had never been indifference. It was grief. The specific, unbearable grief of a man watching the exact thing he'd spent 7 years protecting slip permanently out of his hands, and knowing he had no one to blame but himself and the silence he'd chosen. For one long, suspended moment, the ballroom held its breath, waiting to see which truth would win, the one glittering on bent knee in front of her, or the one standing across the room, finally showing his hand 7 years too late. Then Min Jae turned and walked out, and the sound of the ballroom door closing behind him was louder than the glass had ever been. Amara didn't answer Daniel that night, not because she didn't know her own heart, but because watching Kang Min Jae's face crack open for 1 second had rearranged 7 years of certainty in the time it takes a wine glass to hit marble. "I need a minute," she told Daniel, and to his credit, because the man was maddeningly, consistently decent, he simply nodded, tucked the ring box back into his jacket, and said, "Take all the minutes you need. I'm not going anywhere." Which, if you're keeping score at home, is exactly what a healthy, secure man says, and exactly what Kang Min Jae had never once said to her in 7 years of curated silence. She found him on the terrace, staring out at a skyline he technically owned pieces of, one hand braced on the railing like it was the only thing keeping 7 years of architecture from collapsing all at once. "You dropped your drink," she said. Because after 7 years of rehearsed indifference, apparently the only thing she had left in her arsenal was sarcasm. "I did. That's new. You don't drop things. You don't do anything you haven't already calculated 3 moves ahead." She crossed her arms, gown catching the wind, ringless fingers cold. "So what was tonight? Miscalculation, Or was there actually a person under all that ice taking notes this whole time? Min Jae didn't turn around. Go back inside, Amara. Answer him. That's it? 7 years? And that's the speech? Something in her cracked wide open, all the careful furniture dusting composure she'd built over a decade finally splintering. You know what the worst part is? I used to think you just didn't see me. I built a whole life around that theory. Turns out that's not even the cruel version. The cruel version is you saw me completely and decided the smartest business decision you ever made was pretending you didn't. You don't understand what you're asking me to explain. Then explain it. Her voice cracked, and she hated that it did. Hated that after everything, this man could still find the one nerve nobody else had ever touched. Because right now, there is a genuinely wonderful man inside holding a ring and asking me to build an easy, uncomplicated life with him. And the only thing standing between me and saying yes is the fact that you dropped a glass of scotch like it physically hurt you to watch it happen. So either that meant something, or I am about to marry a stranger's replacement for a ghost, and I deserve to know which. For the first time in 7 years, Kang Min-jae turned around and let her see all of it. Not the curated glance, not the calculated dismissal, but the whole unedited weight of a man who had spent nearly a decade choosing her safety over his own peace. There was a man, he said quietly, in a hospital corridor 7 years ago. Your father. Amara went very still. He didn't die owing debt to strangers, Amara. He died owing a promise to me, and I made him one back. The only thing I had to offer a dying man who couldn't stop apologizing for what he was about to leave behind. I told him I'd keep you safe. Not comfortable, not happy, safe. And in my world, the only women who stay safe are the ones nobody believes anyone loves. The wind seemed to actually stop for a second, the way it does in stories, though Amara suspected it was just her own breath catching. You've been protecting a promise, she said slowly, instead of loving me out loud. I have been doing both every single day, and I was too much of a coward to tell you the difference. His jaw tightened, the mask trying and failing to reassemble itself. Tonight, when he knelt in front of you, I understood, finally 7 years too late, that a promise kept in silence is indistinguishable from a promise never made at all. I dropped the glass because for 1 second, I let myself imagine a version of tonight where I was the one on the ground. And I realized I'd spent so long protecting you from my enemies that I forgot to protect us from my own silence. Amara stood there, ringless hands trembling, caught exactly where the last chapter had left her, between a truth just spoken and a truth still waiting on bent knee inside. Except now she understood something neither man in her life had bothered to tell her outright. Her father hadn't died owing anyone anything. He died trying to save her from a version of love that almost cost her everything anyway. And somewhere inside that ballroom, old enemies who had watched Min-jae's mask slip were already making calls. Because in Seoul, a broken glass wasn't just a broken glass. It was an invitation. By the time Amara walked back into the ballroom, the enemies had already started making their calls. Cho Sang-hoon watched the whole scene unfold from a corner table, swirling his champagne with the patience of a man who had waited a very long time for exactly this. He was the head of a rival syndicate that had spent the better part of a decade trying to find a crack in Kang Min-jae's foundation. And tonight, God had apparently decided to hand it to him gift-wrapped, with a broken glass and a stricken face as the bow on top. Interesting, Sang-hoon murmured to the man beside him, a lawyer who did quiet, deniable work for several families who preferred their violence laundered through paperwork. 7 years we've been told the girl means nothing to him. 7 years and one ring drops her value higher than his entire shipping division. You think he'll move against the other man? I think, Sang-hoon said, setting down his glass with theatrical gentleness, as if mocking the one Min-jae had just shattered. That Kang Min-jae just told an entire ballroom of powerful people exactly where to aim if they ever want to bring him to his knees. The only question now is who gets there first. By midnight, 3 separate families had opened separate, quiet lines of communication, all asking some version of the same question. What does it cost to make Kang Min-jae bleed? And does the woman come with a discount if we take her instead of killing her? Amara knew none of this yet. She only knew that Daniel was still waiting inside, patient as a lighthouse, and that Min-jae's confession had rearranged something in her chest she wasn't ready to name. You're back, Daniel said, standing as she approached, reading her face the way he always did, carefully, without demanding anything from what he found there. "Do you need more time?" "I need the truth," she said, "and I think I finally got some of it. Just not all of it." She took his hand, the easy, uncomplicated hand of a man who had never once made her feel like an inconvenient liability, and felt the ring box still tucked against his palm, waiting. "Can you give me until tomorrow? Not because I don't know how I feel about you. Because I need to understand what I just walked away from out there before I can walk toward anything else with a clear conscience." Daniel exhaled, the kind of exhale that costs a man something. "I've spent months choosing you loudly, Amara. I'm not going to start being quiet now, when it's the hardest thing to do." He pressed a kiss to her knuckles, gentle, undemanding. "Tomorrow. But I need you to know, whatever's out there on that terrace, whatever debt or history it is, I'm not competing with a ghost forever. I deserve an answer eventually. So do you." She nodded, throat tight, and that's when her phone buzzed. Not a calendar reminder this time, but a text from a number she didn't recognize, containing 4 words that turned her stomach to ice. "Ask him about the accountant." Before she could process it, a second text arrived from the same unknown number. "7 years ago, your father didn't owe money to strangers. He owed it to Kang Min-jae. Ask him who really put your father in that hospital bed." The ballroom noise dimmed to static in her ears. Somewhere behind her, Min-jae had re-entered, composure stitched back into place, scanning the room the way he always did. Except now she understood that scan wasn't paranoia. It was 7 years of habit, built from actually loving someone enough to count every thread in the room. Their eyes met across the crowd, and for the first time, Amara didn't look away first. If you've ever loved someone who kept the truth from you to protect you, you already know how this story goes. Protection built on secrets always collapses the same way, one text message at a time. Comment below if you think Amara deserves the whole truth right now. No more sacrifice, no more silence, because I promise you, the people sending these texts don't want to save her. They want to use her, the same way they've always planned to. Min-jae crossed the room toward her, and for the first time in 7 years, it was Amara who spoke first. "Who put my father in that hospital bed, Min-jae?" The music didn't stop this time, but something in his face did. Kang Min-jae had faced down men with guns, men with lawyers, men with entire governments behind them, and none of them had ever made him hesitate the way Amara's question did, standing there in a ballroom full of witnesses, waiting for an answer he'd spent 7 years avoiding. "Not here," he said quietly. "You don't get to decide that anymore." Her voice was steady, which surprised her more than it surprised him. "You've decided everything for 7 years. What I knew, what I felt, what I was allowed to ask. That ends tonight." He studied her for a long moment, and something in his shoulders finally gave way, like a man setting down a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it wasn't part of his own body. "Your father didn't come to me a stranger," he said. "He worked for me. Bookkeeping, small accounts, nothing important. Until he noticed a discrepancy in a client ledger that belonged to a man named Sung-hoon, dressed up as one of my own transactions. Your father came to me with it because he trusted me enough to think I'd want to know I was being framed." Framed for what? Money laundering charges that would have handed federal prosecutors everything they needed to dismantle my entire organization. Sang-hoon had been building the paper trail for months, using my name, waiting for the right moment to hand it to the authorities and walk away clean while I went to prison for his crimes. Min-jae's jaw tightened. "Your father found it before Sang-hoon finished covering his tracks. That made your father the only loose thread left." Amara felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her heels. The accident that put him in the hospital wasn't an accident. It was a warning, meant for your father, meant to make him hand over the evidence and disappear quietly. Min-jae's voice, usually so controlled, cracked at the edges now. 7 years of restraint finally giving way. "I got to the hospital before Sang-hoon's men could finish the job. Your father made me promise with what turned out to be his last coherent hour that I would protect you the way I hadn't managed to protect him. He didn't die owing me a debt, Amara. He died paying one. The debt of trusting me with information that should have stayed buried. So all of this," she said, gesturing at the ballroom, "the 7 years, the cold dinners and colder galas, the indifference, the silence, that was you protecting me from the man who actually put my father in that hospital bed." Sang-hoon has spent 7 years waiting for me to show weakness. Tonight, I handed it to him on a silver platter in front of half of Seoul's underworld. He exhaled, and for once the exhaustion in it wasn't performance. I told myself silence was armor. I never once considered that it was also a wall keeping you from understanding what you were actually up against. Across the room, as if summoned by his own name, Sang-hoon raised his glass in a small, mocking toast, and Amara understood with sudden, sick clarity why Min-jae's face had gone white when he saw it. The same gesture, the same theatrical patience the man had probably worn the night her father's accident was arranged. "He's not going to just walk away now, is he?" she said. It wasn't a question. No. Min-jae's eyes didn't leave Sang-hoon across the room. "He's going to come for the one thing that will finally make me sloppy enough to bury myself." And unfortunately tonight, I confirmed for the entire room exactly what that is. If you've ever watched someone you love become collateral in a war they didn't start, you understand exactly what's coming next. And if you think Sang-hoon deserves a single ounce of mercy for turning a grieving daughter into a bargaining chip, say so loudly in the comments. Because the next chapter is going to test exactly how far a man will go to keep a promise he made to a dying father 7 years too late to matter, or exactly in time to matter more than anything else. Amara looked between the man she'd spent 7 years failing to understand and the man across the room smiling like he'd already won, and made a decision that would have terrified her a week ago. "Then let's stop protecting me quietly," she said, "and start fighting him loudly. Together or not at all." Sang-hoon had spent 7 years waiting for Kang Min-jae to make a mistake. What he hadn't counted on was Amara making the first move. 2 days after the gala, she requested a meeting with him directly, publicly, at the foundation's offices. Cameras from 3 business journals conveniently already scheduled to be there for an unrelated donor announcement. Sang-hoon, arrogant enough to believe he'd already won, accepted immediately. Men who've spent a decade hunting for weakness rarely recognize a trap dressed up as an invitation. "You wanted to speak with me," he said, settling into the chair across from her, amused, expectant, already composing the victory speech he'd give his own people later. "I wanted to thank you," Amara said, and watched the smile falter, just slightly, at the wrong response. "For 7 years, I thought Kang Min-jae simply didn't love me. I built an entire life around that lie. Then you sent me a text message telling me to ask him about my father and accidentally handed me the truth instead." She slid a folder across the table. "Copies, not originals. Min-jae's lawyers had made sure of that. The laundering evidence my father found. The hospital records from the night of his accident. A signed statement from the private investigator you hired to arrange it, who, it turns out, values his own freedom considerably more than your continued employment." Sang-hoon's composure cracked exactly the way Min-jae's had at the gala. One unguarded second, caught this time not by a room full of witnesses, but by a single recorder Amara had turned on the moment he sat down. "You have no idea what you've just done," he said quietly. "I know exactly what I've done," Amara replied. "I've made sure that the next time you try to frame a man for your crimes, the entire financial press already has the receipts. Journalists love a redemption story, Mr. Choi. They love a villain even more. The story broke within 48 hours, not as underworld gossip, but as a financial fraud expose, clean enough for public prosecutors to act on without anyone needing to whisper the word Mafia at all. Sang-hoon's empire, built on borrowed menace and other people's silence, did what those things always do when the lights come on. It collapsed. Quickly, quietly, and almost embarrassingly fast. The way bullies always do once someone finally calls their bluff in public. Kang Min-jae watched it happen from a distance, exactly the way Amara had asked him to. "This was supposed to be my fight," he told her afterward, standing in the same terrace where he'd finally told her the truth. "For 7 years, you decided which fights were yours alone to carry," she said. "I'm done being something you protect quietly. If we're doing this, we do it together, loudly, or we don't do it at all." He looked at her the way she'd waited a decade for. Not calculation, not restraint, just a man finally letting someone see exactly what he'd been hiding. "I don't know how to love someone loudly, Amara. I've only ever known how to protect people by disappearing into the background of their lives." "Then it's a good thing," she said, "that I'm patient. I've had 7 years of practice." Daniel, for his part, took the news the way decent men take endings they didn't choose. but somehow always half expected, with grace, a little heartbreak, and the quiet dignity of someone who understood finally that Amara's hesitation on the ballroom floor had never really been about choosing between two men. It had been about choosing herself first for once, after years of being told she wasn't allowed to. You deserved someone who chose you loudly from day one, he told her, the ring long since returned to its box. I hope he figures out how to actually do that. He's learning, Amara said, and meant it. 6 months later, at a much smaller gathering than any charity gala Seoul had ever thrown. Just close friends, real ones, the kind who'd earned the invitation instead of bought it. Kang Min-jae stood in front of everyone, held Amara's hand in both of his, and said, out loud, in front of witnesses, the sentence he'd rehearsed and deleted 1,000 times over 7 silent years. I love this woman. I have loved her since the night I promised her father I would, and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving that a promise kept in silence was never enough. The room didn't inhale in shock this time. It simply exhaled, finally, in relief. The way a city does when the storm it's been bracing for turns out, at last, to be nothing but clear skies. Because sometimes, the greatest confession isn't spoken with words. Sometimes it just takes someone brave enough to stop waiting for silence to become love and choose, out loud, to build something louder instead.